that the benefits to be gained from so doing are perceived to be sufficiently large. The sentience position rules out such a cost-benefit approach. Even if there is a benefit to be had from practices that inflict suffering on animals, these practices should not be permitted because they infringe the rights of animals not to suffer. Well, what should we make of this alternative animal rights position? How am I doing for time, by the way? 5 more minutes. Well, when I presented this view, I usually get attacked from all sides. Traditional animal rightists say it doesn't go far enough because it still allows animals to be used. That's the reactionary bullshit response. Others argue that it's utopian because it's unrealistic, because it will never be politically acceptable. Most of you will probably be in the latter camp. That is, here today will be in the latter camp. So you'll argue that, yeah, that sounds viable ethically, but it's all too politically unrealistic, and therefore it's inappropriate for me to describe it as a non-ideal theory. Well, I want to make a number of points in response to this objection that it's a utopian position. In the first place, there's a great deal of utility for a social movement in presenting its case in terms of rights, precisely because, as with the concept of justice, rights have such a high status in political discourse. There's little chance that any cause will be taken seriously in the contemporary world that cannot be expressed as a demand for the recognition or enforcement of rights of one kind or another. Secondly, utilising the sentience position still allows animals to be used. What it rules out is infliction of suffering. Thirdly, it's an aspirational position. It's demanding, but it's aspirational. And social movement goals shouldn't be utopian, to be sure, but equally they shouldn't be too moderate so as to bore their adherents to death. And I think a commitment to animal welfare does precisely that. So it seems to me that this sentience position represents a reasonable balance between those animal rights advocates who want the complete abolition of the use of animals on the one hand, and decision makers and most of the public who would appear to be only willing at present to embrace a moderate welfarism. And the fourth point is that I think it's right to say too that the focus on suffering in the sentience position does strike a chord with public opinion. There's some evidence to suggest that it's the infliction of suffering that really concerns the public, rather than the sacrifice of animal lives. And some opinion polling evidence does suggest that this concern about animal suffering outweighs concern about the perceived benefits of using animals. And here we need to ask the question, what exactly do the public understand by the term animal welfare? And I ask that question because there's some evidence that the public confuse animal welfare as an ethic with animal welfare as a science. And because of that, it provides us with evidence that the theory of rights based on eradicating suffering may be actually closer to the public's position than the skeptics think. Take the 5 freedoms, which were identified in the 1960s by a British parliamentary committee set up by the British government to look into factory farming. And they came up with these 5 freedoms as the major characteristics of good animal welfare. And since then, in Britain and elsewhere, they've become, however symbolically, the goals of a variety of public bodies. But these 5 freedoms is not animal welfare. It's not equivalent to animal welfare in an ethical and public policy sense. What it represents is an aspirational list of what good animal welfare would look like from the perspective of the animal welfare scientist. They're designed to eradicate suffering. But from an ethical and public policy perspective, on the other hand, the 5 freedoms may not be what animal welfare mandates. This will largely depend upon whether the infringement of any of them is regarded as necessary. If the infringement of them is necessary, the animal welfare ethic permits suffering. So animal welfare in an empirical scientific sense may well not be met by animal welfare in an ethical and public policy sense. But an interesting thought follows from that, because if it's the case that what most people understand by animal welfare is the empirical and scientific version and not the ethical version, then it may well be that if they knew enough, they'd reject the ethical and public policy version of animal welfare as not far-reaching enough. It's just a thought. Okay, I'll wrap things up. What I've done in this talk is to suggest that the treatment of animals should be a central concern of public policy makers. It shouldn't be left to individual moral conscience. However, those animal ethicists and activists who wish to influence public policy in order to improve the treatment of animals need to ensure that their ethical theories and goals are not too idealistic. And I model 3 possible so-called non-ideal theories: the indirect duty view, the animal welfare view, and the sentient animal rights position. All of them have their merits, and it's certainly worthwhile including them in any ethical audit of public policy involving animals. My central argument, though, is that the animal rights model can provide the most appropriate non-ideal theory, provided that it's shorn of these abolitionist trappings, and the emphasis is placed on animals' interest in not suffering instead. And as such, I commend it to you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Now it's working. All right. If there's just a couple of questions, I'd like to squeeze those in.
Sorry, I can't see where that's coming from. Oh.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. If you could just let us know your name and, if relevant, your affiliation. If we'll start in the back, please. Yes.
Robert, do animals have an interest in avoiding death?
What I try to do is develop, in the book that's coming out, and obviously I didn't have the chance to explore all of it, is to develop an ideal and a non-ideal theory of justice for animals. The non-ideal theory, which is based on sentience, rejects or ignores the issue of the value of animal life. And it does so partly because we could sit here for months and I could never convince you of my view on the value of animal lives, probably the value of human lives too, come to think of it. And, you know, philosophers have argued about this for centuries, and no definitive answer has arrived. So I suggest rejecting that and focusing on sentience, which offers us the biggest chance of a clear acceptance of an empirical point about the characteristics of animals. They're sentient. It's accepted, widely accepted that animals are sentient. If we start talking about the value of animal lives, we're on a loser, because it simply won't be accepted by enough of the most important people. However, in the book, I do seek to develop an ideal theory of justice for animals, which does explore the value of animal lives. And I think my view is pretty conventional in ethics, in arguing that whilst animals have an interest in continued life, it's not as great as those of animals. But I'm prepared to say I might be wrong on that. And no doubt we could argue about it.
Thank you. The back row.
Thank you, Robert. David Dell, I'm National Coordinator for the Australian Pest Animal Strategy. Well, I think that the sentience position is really very interesting, and it kind of touches on some real-life stuff that I deal with out in the world. And a question that I put to you on that is, can the suffering of a pest animal such as one wild dog be justified if it avoids the suffering of 50 sheep as potential prey who are likely to be maimed and mutilated? How would the sentience position deal with that?
Well, all rights theories have to grapple with conflicts between rights. All I'm saying is that we should include animals in that calculation. So there may be various different ways of calculating where how you adjudicate in a particular conflict. All I'm saying is that animals ought to be included in that process. That may sound like a bit of a get out here, but I mean, according to the animal welfare ethic, there is no debate about the suffering of animals in that context, because if human benefit or the benefit of other animals is justified, then inflicting suffering on one animal is ethically fine. All I'm saying is that if we take into account the suffering of animals using a rights-based ethic, you have then to include animal rights within that calculation. There are some philosophers who argue that rights are absolute, and it isn't possible to sacrifice individual rights in order to benefit the greater good. But, you know, moral philosophers argue about this endlessly. But most philosophers argue that there are cases where rights can be traded away in order to benefit a greater number of rights. In fact, in Tom Regan's book, which is a great primer in moral philosophy, actually, he does spend page after page after page discussing this issue of conflicting rights. Unnecessarily, in my view, because, you know, his major point was that animals ought to be part of this calculation. And I agree with him on that score, at least in the case of suffering.
Jack Goff from New South Wales Farmers. I'm just wondering, is a growing, I think, philosophical trend towards what might be ecological ethic in terms of the way that we approach animals, where the relationship's informed by a partnership as the idea between how we work with animals. I'm wondering where you see that on that kind of continuum of non-ideal and ideal theories. I think there's probably people who see it as a non-ideal possibility and others who see that as what might be the ideal situation.
This idea of stewardship.
No, as a kind of relationship and
Yeah.
partnership with animals rather than having, you know, us be stewards of animals. But it's maybe more of an ecological ethic.
Well, that in many ways is a starting point for my study here, because if you're engaging in a theory of justice, you have to grapple with so-called contractarian theories, and Rawls provides a contractarian theory of justice. And such theories argue that animals can't, well, Rawls argues at least, that animals can't be included within a theory of justice. They can't be beneficiaries because they're not capable of being partners in any form of contract, because they're not capable of keeping to moral agreements. They're not capable of knowing what has been agreed. But there have been some philosophers who have argued that